Welcome ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I am Grem the Lazy Gremlin and this is Let's Talk, the show where I talk about games. Any games, because I want to. So, let's talk about Darkest Dungeon.
You will arrive along the old road. It winds with a troubling, serpent-like suggestion through the corrupted countryside, leading only, I fear, to ever more tenebrous places. There is a sickness in the ancient pitted cobbles of the old road, and on its writhing path you will face viciousness, violence, and perhaps other damnably transcendent terrors. So steel yourself, and remember there can be no bravery without madness. The old road will take you to hell, but in that gaping abyss, we will find our redemption.
Now this one's a treat to behold. Darkest Dungeon, or what I and many others like to call it, Dankest Dungeon, is all about that sweet, sweet Lovecraftian atmosphere, and oh boy do we get a lot of it. I myself just can't get enough of Lovecraft, and any game sporting such a theme gets my attention immediately. Darkest Dungeon is essentially a 2D dungeon crawler roguelite that's all about adversity and barely overcoming impossible odds. The idea is to make the best of what you got, and when something goes wrong, you'll just roll with the punches. Characters are going to die, missions are going to fail, and you'll feel like you keep running into a brick wall face first over and over again. But when things finally go your way, the feeling is oh so good. The story begins with you receiving a letter from the current head of your house, begging you to return to the family estate to put things right, to drive back whatever darkness he has unleashed upon the world. As you return, you come to realize just how bad things really are. The estate is in ruins, the town is barely livable, and even the Undertaker has lost what little of his mind remained. It's time to get to work. You hire passing adventurers for expeditions into the antiquated halls of your legacy, and proceed to rebuild your once great estate into its former glory, and drive back whatever antediluvian horrors dwell within. So, first you'll be presented with your town. Here you can do everything required to keep your people alive and kicking, such as cure diseases, upgrade skills and armor, learn survival skills, and keep your people sane. We'll get to those mechanics a bit later. As I mentioned before, Darkest Dungeon is a dungeon crawler through and through in the most direct sense of the word. You hire a team of 4 adventurers to do your bidding and venture into various different locations surrounding your family estate, such as the Ruins, Weld, Warrens, Cove, and later on, the Darkest Dungeon, which resides in the bowels of your family estate. You're presented with a list of goals, or more specifically, a kill list that requires you to murder various different eldritch horrors. Every dungeon type will eventually have boss fights available, and these bosses will test the mettle of your group, and quite possibly slaughter a few members in the process. The dungeon designs breathe atmosphere and dread, and the bosses are varied and grotesque, from necromancers to giant pig monsters, with their own mechanics to tag along. Suffice to say, the art in Darkest Dungeon is beautiful and straight up my alley. Every boss is also sporting their own enigmatic lore and backstory, which are told from the perspective of the narrator.
Mastery over life and death was chief among my early pursuits. I began in humility, but my ambition was limitless. Who could have divined the prophetic import of something as unremarkable as a twitch in the leg of a dead rat?
Before we move on, we need to talk about one of the many things that make this game absolutely amazing. the narrator. This man deserves all the praise in the world, and he delivers the game to new heights with his buttery, dark-toned voice. He plays the former head of your house who is presumably dead, and now follows and narrates your journey while inserting tidbits of his own life story into the mix.
Our family name, once so well regarded, is now barely whispered aloud by decent folk. They breed quickly down there in the dark, but perhaps we can slay them even faster. In time, you will know the tragic extent of my failings.
The things he has to say never get repetitive, and I found myself always ready to hear more. As you continue to advance in the game, you hear more and more of his story and what he's done before he called you back to the estate. Personally, this is my favorite part of the game, and it breathes so much life into the experience. The dungeon crawling in Darkest Dungeon is quite simple and works very well in my opinion. When you enter a dungeon, you will start in an empty room. Rooms are connected with corridors that can have a variety of different objects and events, such as boxes and sacks of loot, ambushes, bookshelves, shrines and torture devices, and the list goes on. Suffice to say, the game has a lot of interactable things in every dungeon, and each dungeon type has their own exclusive objects and items to play around with. Another cool thing about these objects is the fact that you can use various consumable items to coax out different effects than what you would usually get just by interacting with the object normally. Rooms, on the other hand, usually have special things like treasure chests or shrines that yield handsome rewards, but are usually guarded by a formidable group of enemies, while other times there might not be anything at all in said rooms. For every dungeon crawl, you'll be presented with a goal like explore 90% of the room, or complete 100% of room battles. Sometimes you will even have the option to pick a dungeon that requires you to gather some quest items. These items force you to sacrifice precious backspace and, more likely than not, to leave behind valuable loot in order to complete the quest. Darkest Dungeon is also sporting a camping system which is used in larger dungeons. This mechanic allows you to restore the group's health by feeding them and using their special camping abilities for various effects, such as buffs, healing, and stress healing. It is also worth noting that during camping, your party will also talk amongst themselves and comment on the situation, which I find to be a nice little touch. While exploring creepy, dangerous dungeons, it's important to keep an eye on your light level as well. And by this, I mean your torch. The light level affects a few things like the darker it is, the more loot you will find, for some reason, but enemies are also stronger. This mechanic can be used to make more precious gold, but is also a very dangerous thing and not to be taken lightly. Now for the combat. The combat system in Darkest Dungeon is turn-based, quite RNG, and operates based on character position. What this means is that your characters, as well as the enemy, can use abilities based on their position in combat. You usually want the strong melee characters in positions 1 and 2 to take the brunt of the force, while the weaker support and damage characters tend to be in the back in positions 3 and 4. The game also has various abilities for characters and monsters that allow them to interfere with positions by moving the target either back or forward. These abilities come in handy for situations where you need to get rid of heavy hitters or a monster that is dealing far too much sanity damage to your team. Or maybe you just need to clean out corpses to reach the back row with your melee characters. Dead monsters leave behind a corpse when they keel over. These carcasses can be a nuisance but can be destroyed. This means you need to think a tad more before killing anything, since you can fuck yourself over by blocking your melee characters from accessing the opposing back row and allowing them to continue to wail on your team a bit longer. When shit hits the fan and someone is about to keel over and die, it's called a death's door. This mechanic allows dying characters to hold on so that someone can help them. Characters who are at death's door gain a debuff to pretty much everything and have a high chance of dying from any damage they are inflicted with. However, if one of your other party members can manage to heal the dying character, they can be saved. But the debuff remains. Though you need to remember, if a character dies, they remain dead. The game has a very wide number of classes that you can use to build your dungeon crawling teams. Every class has their own speciality, such as healing, frontline fighter, damage over time support, or even a character that increases how much loot you find, but is relatively useless in combat. Every character has things called quirks that are gained and lost as the characters experience new things, both good and bad, but mostly just bad. These quirks affect character stats quite dramatically at times and force you to think who to bring along to your expedition. The game allows you to mix and match these class combinations and even has a few meta builds in there, with fun little nicknames like The Usual Suspects or Stun Rise, Stun Set. These metas can help you understand what classes are good together and are also a lot of fun to discover. Which brings us to what is probably the most iconic mechanic in Darkest Dungeon, the sanity system. During dungeon crawling, most everything will affect your group's sanity in one way or another. Low light will stress them out, monsters can do something horrid to them, they might find something that leaves them reeling, and so on and so on. You can see the current stress of any of your characters below their health bar, which is indicated in white squares. Once this bar fills up, one of two things will happen. Your party member either goes insane or steals his or her resolve, gaining a massive puff. In town, you essentially do all the prep work for your expeditions. You can cure diseases, remove bad quirks as well as lock in good ones, heal stress, upgrade skills and gear, buy trinkets, teach survival skills, and of course, hire new adventurers. I personally love all the stress relief options the town has to offer, with their flavor texts and all. You can send your people to the chapel to do religious mumbo-jumbo crazy people things, like praying or self-flagellation, or send them to the tavern to do normal people things, like getting blasted, visiting the brothel, or gambling your money away. Upgrading your characters, on the other hand, is a tiny bit underwhelming, since there are no upgrade trees, just one linear path with only stat boosts and no special extra effects. This applies to both gear and skill upgrades. Your characters can also learn new survival skills which are used during camping. These skills are, however, extremely expensive to learn and should be picked out carefully. As you progress in the game, you'll get to use the loot you've gathered from dungeons that are in the form of deeds, busts, shields, etc. to upgrade your buildings for reduced prices and such. This will also affect the outward appearance of the town, bringing it back from the brink of death to something alive. So, to be especially blunt, Darkest Dungeon is a magnificent game, worthy of being considered a classic. My few minor nitpicks are almost exclusively limited to the upgrade system, which is woefully shallow. I do hope Red Hook Studios decides to overhaul it at some point in the future to include more variety and options for building up your team. Oh, and while we're at it, I'd like to see more of, well, everything. Especially new characters and locations, as well as some cosmetic options. So, on that note, I'm going to put my full trust in Red Hook Studios, since it seems like they know exactly what they're doing and have shown so in the past. So, I believe that is all for today. I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you for watching. I'm Grem the Lazy Gremlin, and this has been Let's Talk Darkest Dungeon. I'll see you guys again next time.